Right, Philip Goff, welcome to Solicited Advice.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm looking forward to having a little chat.
It's a pleasure to have you. You are now known as one of the foremost proponents of panpsychism. And I was doing a bit of research for this interview, and I stumbled across this really fascinating paper. I think you'll have heard of it. It's by a very, very well-known author in this field. And it's called Why Panpsychism Doesn't Explain Consciousness. And it's by a guy called Philip Goff. And it was, from over a decade ago now. And I was reading it through and I was thinking, wow, these are some really, really interesting arguments against panpsychism from a very unfamiliar source. What was going through your mind as you wrote that pretty strident critique of panpsychism? And then what changed your mind about it later?
Oh, brilliant. You've done your homework, Joe. Yeah, this is actually one of my earliest publications, Why Panpsychism Doesn't Help Explain Consciousness, I guess before my conversion to panpsychism. And I recently, a couple of years ago, published a paper called How Exactly Panpsychism Helps Explain Consciousness. So I've sort of spent my whole career creating a problem and then trying to solve it, because that is one of my most cited papers, and was taken up by David Chalmers subsequently, and I guess is seen as the classic challenge to panpsychism. What I did in the paper, let's start with the problem, I suppose, is set up a sort of zombie challenge to panpsychism. So panpsychists often start by critiquing physicalism, saying, physicalism's a load of rubbish. Physicalists can't account for consciousness. And as you know, Joe, there's these arguments, the knowledge argument, the zombie argument. And the zombie argument, let's not necessarily get into all the details. We can go where you want, but the basic idea of a zombie is a perfect physical duplicate of a human being, an atom for atom duplicate, but one which has no consciousness. There's nothing that it's like to be a zombie. It's an unfeeling mechanism. So you stab it, it screams and tries to run away, but it doesn't actually feel pain. And there's lots of complexity to this argument, but anti-physicalists try to use this to show that you can't explain consciousness in physical terms, because if these things are conceivable and then they're possible, that shows that consciousness must be something extra to our physical nature. And then we think, oh no, we need an alternative. What do we go for? Maybe we go for dualism, maybe we go for panpsychism. So the worry I raised in this paper many years ago, as when I was a little boy, not quite a young man, was a sort of panpsychist version where this creature, it doesn't completely lack consciousness. Its fundamental particles are conscious, right? The electrons and quarks making it up are conscious in the way the panpsychist thinks particles are conscious. But with the panpsychist zombie, it is not conscious. So the brain, the organism, no large part of the panpsychist zombie is conscious. So it's a non-conscious thing that's made up of little conscious things. And then the thought was, well, that seems to be conceivable. If it's conceivable, is it possible? Does that raise the same deep challenges for panpsychism that the original zombie raises for physicalism? And then it looks like, oh my God, we've got nowhere.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's
the worry.
It's a worry that I've had with various kinds of panpsychism. I mean, we can talk a little bit about the intuitions behind panpsychism later on in the interview. But one immediate thing that I tend to feel upon reading a particular panpsychist, especially with someone like Galen Strawson, because I think he actually probably is the closest to this position, but also your own writings, is that the panpsychist seems to say something like there are these, fundamental particles that contain certain properties that when you put them in certain arrangements give rise to macro-conscious states. And the physicalist seems to say, well, there are these fundamental particles. I can't say particles today. And when you arrange them in certain combinations, they give rise to particular macro-conscious states, or as they would put it, just conscious states. And there's a real symmetry between it seems like the combination problem for panpsychism, which I think, as you say in a footnote, is very similar to the problem that you're putting forward in your paper, and the so-called hard problem of consciousness, this idea of how to explain where consciousness arises from seemingly non-conscious particles. And there's always, for me, been a real symmetry between these two problems. And I've certainly thought, upon reading some panpsychist writings, I'm not entirely sure what advances are being made in this reconceptualization. But of course, you, like many panpsychists, do think that there are some advances being made. What are those advances?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point you're making. And indeed, it was the point I was making in this paper, that there is this kind of symmetry between the explanatory gap problems the physicalist faces. Oh, how do we get consciousness just from electrochemical signaling? That's on the one hand, but also the challenges the panpsychist faces with, how do we get our consciousness, unified human or animal consciousness, from little conscious particles? And you might think, this move to panpsychism doesn't get us anywhere. I suppose what I've come to think is those kinds of challenges only apply to a very particular kind of panpsychism, a very reductionist form of panpsychism, really that really mirrors physicalism very closely, that says really there's just conscious particles, and what we call Joe's mind is just a collection of conscious particles, or you get Joe's consciousness just by sticking together a load of conscious particles. Yes, then you do start to get these very difficult combination problem issues, like, because our consciousness seems to involve a deep unity. It's hard to see how you could get that just sticking a load of conscious particles together. However, not all panpsychists go for this very reductionist story. Many panpsychists are happy to feel that a more sort of layered picture of reality, where there are new unities, maybe new forms of consciousness that pop up at higher levels. You see, so it's very, very different from that sort of reductionist physicalist story. Now you might say to me, well, what's the advantage of being a panpsychist then, if you're not reducing everything to conscious particles? Well, I think the central advantaged explanatory benefit of panpsychism has nothing to do with this. The central advantage of panpsychism is that we explain physical reality in terms of these simple forms of consciousness, and everything bottoms out in one kind of property, in just very simple forms of consciousness. So I think, see panpsychism as turning the problem of consciousness upside down. So rather than starting with physical stuff, particles, fields, and then trying to get everything else out of that, and then ultimately consciousness out of neurophysiological processes, we do it the other way around. We start with consciousness, very simple forms of consciousness, and we explicate physical reality in terms of those simple forms of consciousness. So the physical is explained away. And I think whether or not, so if you have to add some higher level forms of consciousness or primitive unities, okay, that's a bit more of a cost to the story, but still, we've managed to explain physical reality in terms of consciousness, and that's very attractive.
And perhaps I'd love to go into a bit more detail about the explanatory story. So there, this idea of explaining physical reality through an appeal to consciousness in some fundamental sense. In what way does the physical kind of emerge from this more consciousness first story, let's say?
Good. So the inspiration for the contemporary panpsychist research program that's been growing over the last 10 or 15 years, the inspiration is some very important work by Bertrand Russell from the 1920s. I think of Russell as the Darwin of consciousness. I think he solved all the mysteries. In particular, his book, The Analysis of Matter from 1927. Now, Russell's core insight in this book was that physical science doesn't really tell us what matter is. And when I first heard that, I thought that's ridiculous. You read a book of physics or cosmology, you seem to have this rich story about the nature of space and time and matter. But Russell's point was, yeah, physics is wonderful, but it's exclusively focused on what stuff does. It's not interested in what matter is, it's only interested in what it does. So think about, what does physics tell us about an electron? It tells us that it has mass and charge. And these properties are completely defined in terms of behavior. Things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. It's all about what stuff does. So an analogy I like to give is, doing physics is like playing chess when you don't care what the pieces are made of. You just care what they do, right? Because that's how you play the game. So physics tells us what matter does, not what it is. So in fact, this means that there's a huge hole in our standard scientific story of reality. Physical science tells us what matter does, but not what it is. So we're looking for a place for consciousness. We've got a hole. Maybe we can put consciousness in the hole. And then the resulting view is there is just consciousness at the fundamental level, very simple forms of consciousness behaving in simple, predictable ways, higher levels, more complex forms of consciousness. And then finally, the thought is what physicists are doing is talking about those simplest forms of consciousness. When they're talking about particles or fields, they are talking about those simple forms of consciousness and characterizing them in terms of their behavior with their equations. Now, of course, physicists don't know that's what they're doing, but that's simply because physicists don't care what matter is. All they're interested in, quite rightly, that's their business, all they're interested in is what it does. So it's a very simple, elegant, unified way, I think, of bringing together what we know about consciousness from the inside with what we know about the brain and physical reality more generally from the outside, giving us a single, unified story of it all.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly concur on many points there. Like, I agree with the idea of, that certainly physics doesn't tell you something about the intrinsic nature of things. I kind of, you're with me up to that point. When you say about, okay, we've got this hole and we're going to, in our picture of the world, we're going to fill it with consciousness. Like, why are we going to fill it with consciousness? Is there, because, there's another option of saying either there's a hole there and we don't know how to fill it, something like, which, I personally kind of lean a bit towards. I'm quite happy to say that, for example, physics doesn't describe like intrinsic nature of matter or anything really. But I also tend to have a general skepticism about our ability to know anything about the intrinsic nature of matter or indeed anything else. So what is it that makes consciousness, in your view, the thing to fill this hole?
Good. That's it. You're getting to the core, most important questions here. Thank you. And maybe we could just back up a little bit and talk about the problem of consciousness itself. Because I think consciousness is such a unique phenomenon. And until we get a grip on that, I don't think we're really at first base in theorizing about it. So I think what is unique about consciousness is that we know what it is before we do any science. You often hear in something that really annoys me, you often hear in public discussions of consciousness, people say, consciousness is a mystery, nobody knows what it is. I think that's BS, right? Your consciousness is just what it's like to be you. And you know very well what it's like to be you, at least to a large extent. Consciousness is just feelings and experiences. And, a feeling is defined by how it feels, and you know how it feels when you feel it. Just to clarify slightly, I'm not saying we get everything right about our consciousness. There's really interesting work. For example, I love Eric Schwitzgebel, who's shown, I
was just thinking about that.
Yeah. So
one about the fuzziness in the edge of your vision.
We can come back to that. There's an important nuance there, and I'd be happy for you to challenge me on that. But still, at least we can say to a large extent, we know what consciousness is by being conscious. I would put it this way. To the extent that you know what it's like to be you, you understand your consciousness. So that allows a bit of nuance that maybe we don't quite get right, what it's like to be us. Okay, so I think this contrasts radically with every other phenomenon science deals with. So like take, lightning. You don't know what the hell lightning is before you do the science. It could be the anger of the gods. You do the science, you find out it's electric discharge. Or water. What the hell is water? Is it a fundamental element together with earth and fire and air like the ancient Greeks thought? You do the science, you find out it's H2O. But with consciousness, we already know what it is to a large extent. So it's not like we're looking to science to tell us what it is. I think that the task of consciousness is a unique explanatory project that goes like this. It's to bring together, to unify what we already know about consciousness from the inside with what we know about the brain from the outside. I think that's the task. And I think Panpsychism gives us a wonderful, elegant answer to this, which is simply that matter is what consciousness does. Physical science tells us what matter does. Consciousness is what it is. So here's a way we can think about it. There's two radically different ways we know about reality. We know about consciousness by being consciousness. That's one bit of reality we know about. We know about the physical world through experiments and observations. How do we fit all that together? And I think Panpsychism gives the most simple, elegant answer to that.
Oh, okay. I think there are lots of things there that I have a lot of sympathy with. First of all, I think that at the very least, I am very, very fond of a kind of phenomena-first approach to philosophy, in as much as I think that's something that is shared between a lot of different traditions. Arguably, you've got the phenomenological tradition. You've got Hume does this, starting with what you experience and then going from there. So I'm very on board with that aspect of it. I'm a little bit potentially skeptical on this point of the idea that we know the intrinsic nature of consciousness, pre-theoretically or without kind of thinking about it at all. For one worry that I suspect I might have, that I think there are solutions to, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that, I think about my consciousness and I think, okay, I feel certain things and I believe certain things. I have this kind of rich phenomenology. But then if I were to take a kind of panpsychist view, well, I don't tend to want to ascribe such a rich phenomenology to these kind of particles or to groups of non-human particles and patterns mixed together necessarily. I might do for some, certain animals, but I won't want to do it for an awful lot. That's the classic kind of, panpsychism isn't rocks can think clarification that I think often needs to be made. But nonetheless, then I think we might have a real disconnect, right? Because there are loads of things that I seem to learn from my own introspection about what my consciousness is and what it kind of consists of, that doesn't translate very well into then being used to plug the gap of this, what actually is the intrinsic nature of matter. Because then it does seem like either we're being pushed in a direction whereby, okay, this intrinsic conscious matter stuff is really kind of proto-conscious, in which case I think we edge a little bit towards being basically physicalism. Or, on the other hand, I end up ascribing quite rich phenomenology to these kind of non-human and non-sentient, or non-sentient seeming, let's say, not to make this circular, stuff out in the world, in which case we get a little bit more towards rocks can think. How do you thread the needle there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose I think the concept of consciousness is quite a elastic, flexible concept, and it's important to get clear on what we mean by that. Often the public, when they hear the word consciousness, they think of something very sophisticated like self-consciousness, awareness of one's own existence. But the standard way of understanding it in both science and philosophy, in the West at least, is just subjective experience. Your consciousness is what it's like to be you. Now, what it's like to be a human being is very complex, the result of millions of years of evolution. But, what it's like to be a sheep is simpler. What it's like to be a mouse, simpler still. Is what it's like to be a mouse simpler than a sheep? I don't know. What it's like to be a snail, if there's something that it's like to be a snail, it's much simpler. What about a bed bug? I think there's a grey area among common sense opinion. Is there something that it's like to be a bed bug? If there is, it's of some incredibly simple form. And there doesn't seem to me any obvious cutoff point. If we're just talking about subjective experience, there doesn't seem to be any obvious cutoff point where it couldn't come in an incredibly simple form. And then that's the claim. So it's not the claim that a quark has the consciousness of a human being, that it's wondering if it's Tuesday or feeling existential angst, just that it has some very, very simple form of subjective experience to reflect its very simple physical structure.
Okay, yeah. And how do we get to that kind of... Because it seems like we're doing something a little bit more there than just kind of pre-theoretically experiencing our own experience, if we can use that phraseology. We're kind of abstracting from our own experience, sort of the simplest possible part of it. Have I followed that correctly?
So, I mean, we start with our own consciousness. So I know my consciousness is real just by being conscious. And it's important that we know about consciousness in this quite unique way. You don't know about it from third-person observation. I can't look in your brain and see your feelings and experiences. But we know consciousness is real. And then we also know a lot about behavioral, physical structure stuff from science. And so the question is, how do these fit together? Or just take the case of one's own brain. How does what I know about Philip Goff's consciousness from the inside fit together with what a neuroscientist will tell me about my brain from the outside? Well, one possibility is dualism, right? Maybe Philip Goff's consciousness is in his soul, and that sort of causally interacts with the brain. But that's unnecessary. That's a possibility, but it's unnecessarily complicated and non-simple. I think that the panpsychist answer is simpler, that it's, no, well, my consciousness is the intrinsic nature of my brain. Oh, no, okay, no, you could stop there and you could say, okay, Philip's brain and Joe's brain and human brains and certain animal brains, they have an intrinsic nature and nothing else has an intrinsic nature. But that is a very weird, when you think it through, it's a very weird, inelegant view. So then it's simpler and more unified to say, well, no, everything has an intrinsic nature. Okay, so then the next hypothesis could be, okay, well, the intrinsic nature of brains is consciousness, but the intrinsic nature of other things is some other completely unknown, mysterious intrinsic nature. And I mean, that's a possibility I take seriously, but why go for mystery when you don't have to? So I think the simplest, most elegant hypothesis is that the intrinsic nature of all matter is continuous with the one intrinsic nature we know about.
Right, okay. Because I can kind of see the argument there. I suppose for me, the inference from, let's accept that we know the kind of intrinsic nature of consciousness from the inside, just to kind of, we might come back to that later, because I do think it's interesting to kind of question that. But let's say that we do. I'm not entirely clear on the inference that's then made from, I know the intrinsic nature of what it's like to be me, for example, to then, okay, if that's the only intrinsic nature that I have access to, that I ought to then, all else being equal, I ought to then assume that everything else is of one with that intrinsic nature. Is it just kind of, is that just for considerations of parsimony, or is that, because I intuitively want to say something like, well, I kind of know what it's like to be me from the inside, but regarding everything else, I don't know, and I can't say anything, and I just encounter what things do, and they might have an intrinsic nature, they might, let's say that they do have an intrinsic nature, but whatever it is, I'm never going to be able to get at it. And moreover, in all my interactions with the world, I only ever encounter things through what they do, just like trivially from how they impinge on me. And thus I'm only ever encountering things in some doing. So I suppose that's one aspect of the panpsychist argument I really struggle to get my head around, is where's this inference coming from my from accepting that I know some kind of intrinsic nature of myself, to expanding outwards and saying that I'm going to infer that everything else shares that intrinsic nature. I mean, Schopenhauer does it as well. And I also thought it was kind of like odd when he did it.
Good. I'm going to say one last time, you're asking exactly the right questions, and this is brilliant. I would say that essentially what we're doing here is what we always do in science, which is just try to find the most simple, elegant hypothesis consistent with the data, or that explains the data. What's unique in this case, which is why it's not normal science, is that the data, one of the data points is not from observation and experiments. It's a data point we get just from being conscious. You know, if you're going to be Daniel Dennett and just say, oh no, our only data comes from third person observation experiments. Okay, fine, we don't believe in consciousness. But like most people, I want to say, no, the reality of consciousness is a data point. Okay, so this is the starting point. One data point is my own consciousness and your consciousness, you know? And then the other data point is what we know from physical science about the brain. And then you've just got to look at the different options. What are the different hypotheses? There's substance dualism. Well, no, that's unnecessarily complicated. There is, my brain has an intrinsic nature, or conscious brains have an intrinsic nature, but nothing else does. That's sort of weirdly inelegant and disunified. Conscious brains have an intrinsic nature, but other matter has a very different intrinsic nature. Well, then that's unnecessarily disunified and mysterious. So I just think panpsychism is the most simple, unified hypothesis. And I think by the standards of normal science, that means it's the most probable. I think that's how you do science. You assign the highest probability to the simplest hypothesis compatible with the data. Now, it's very mysterious. And philosophers of science debate this. Why should we think the simplest theory is more likely to be true? And maybe that leads you to anti-realism about science or something. But all I'm doing, I think, is following the standard scientific method, just adding a non-standard data point. The reality of consciousness is known about in a very different way. But look, I hold out a lot of... But look, I would assign a high probability to some of these non-panpsychist alternatives, particularly other things having an intrinsic nature that's not consciousness, that's totally unknown. I assign quite a high probability to that. Not the one that like only brains have an intrinsic nature. That's kind of really weirdly disunified. But the one that other things have a non-conscious nature. Yeah, I think that's a real possibility. If you ask me like what's my credence in panpsychism, I'd say like 60% maybe. So I give a lot of time, a lot of probability to what is sometimes called pan-protopsychism, that the intrinsic nature of particles is not consciousness, but something kind of more rudimentary than consciousness. I mean, just one more thing. This is an important contrast with me and my former PhD supervisor, Galen Strawson, who Alex O'Connor did a good interview with recently. He has this intuition, you can't get consciousness from non-consciousness. So consciousness must be down there all along. And I don't agree with that. And this is, I guess, was one of the motivations for my early opposition to panpsychism that you pointed to, because I was disagreeing with my supervisor on these scores. It's good to have you got to have a rebellion against your teacher a little bit, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely. I suppose my one supposed or one possible disanalogy you could point to here is that, you know, when I'm saying I'm inferring from the intrinsic nature of my own consciousness to the intrinsic nature of everything else, that's a kind of sample size of one that I'm then sort of projecting out onto the rest of reality. I mean, that might be one reason why that's what pushes me, for example, even accepting the idea that we know the intrinsic nature of consciousness from introspection. That's one worry I have about then projecting outwards onto everything else. It's not necessarily that like it's not a data point in favor. It would just be that it's one data point. There are so many things, or there at least seem to be so many things, that then saying everything else must share this one intrinsic nature rather than remaining on the fence seems to me to be like, it seems to place quite a lot of confidence on our ability to extrapolate from this single data point.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it's just a sample size of one, because I take myself to know that you're conscious and my cat
do you know
Kiara,
that
who's
intrinsically?
sleeping over there, is conscious. I would say, I don't know it directly, but I would say I know that you have consciousness, and that's the same, in the very general sense, the same kind of thing I have. So if my consciousness is an intrinsic nature, then yours is too. Unless your consciousness is in a soul, but then we'd have a very disunified theory. Now, it's an interesting question, that the problem of other minds. How do we know other people are conscious? Maybe we could have a chat about that, but I would take that at least as a starting point in theorizing about panpsychism, that we know many other animals are conscious. But still, I think your point has some force. Look, I mean, maybe I'd like to emphasize my confidence about different things. I'm much more confident about, well, for example, the falsity of a view we haven't talked about yet. Maybe you want to physicalism. I think physicalism is just completely makes no sense once we're thinking about the problem of consciousness in the right way. So that's out. Dualism, I think, is a possibility, but it is significantly less parsimonious. But the view you're pushing me on, that, well, I in the academic context, it's called panprotopsychism. It's that other stuff has some intrinsic nature that's not consciousness, that's unknown, that it's certain circumstances it becomes consciousness. And yeah, I'm really open to that possibility. Look, it's just unfortunate that the human epistemic situation is far from ideal, right? You're right. Like the only intrinsic nature we know about is this one thing, consciousness. Everything else we know about the world, I think, is just what stuff does, and you've got to somehow fill it in. And, well, the way I put it in my academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, we know how the intrinsic nature of one bit of matter is filled in, if, like, to take a metaphor, how it's coloured in, how the intrinsic nature of brains is coloured in. The simplest hypothesis is that the intrinsic nature of other matter is coloured in the same way, with the same property. Why? I mean, just put it this way. Why would you suppose there's two kinds of intrinsic nature rather than one, when you've got no reason to do so? Eddington was great on this. He said, it's silly. I like the way he used the word silly. Galen pointed that out to me actually all those years ago. It's silly when we don't know what the hell the intrinsic nature of electrons and quarks is, to suppose it's nothing to do with consciousness, and then we wonder where the consciousness comes from. So that's the kind of thing. But it's very, very uncertain, and I think the hypothesis that's number two for me is what you've been describing, this pan-proto-psychist view. I mean, many academic philosophers sort of see them as part of the same view, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some, pan-proto-psychism, I think, is very interesting, because sometimes it seems to me to be like almost identical to physicalism, and sometimes it seems to me to be almost identical to full-blown panpsychism, and I kind of go back and forth. But I'd like to just bring us back. I want to talk about critiques of physicalism, because I think that they're very, very interesting. I would like to also touch upon this idea of the idea that we have direct access to the intrinsic nature of consciousness. Now, I agree to a certain extent. Like, I agree that it definitely feels like I do. And I am willing to accept that. But I kind of want to question, kind of, do we? And I'm going to talk a little about the Schwitzgebel stuff, because it does seem like I could be mistaken about various aspects of my mind. I could be mistaken about the clarity of my vision. Schwitzgebel's example, for those who don't know, is that most people, if you ask them without telling them that actually the sides of their fields of vision are blurry, will estimate that their vision is kind of in focus all the way through, almost. But if you were to then let someone know about this feature of their own phenomenology, they will then say, oh gosh, yeah, there is blurriness on the side of my vision, and I actually hadn't realized that until now. So it does seem like we can make mistakes about that's a mistake about the content of our phenomenology. However, I don't see any reason, or as in, I agree that it feels very much like I can know the intrinsic nature of consciousness simply by being conscious. I suppose that I'm hesitant to place too much weight on that feeling, just because I don't quite know how epistemically justified I am. I agree that it's very intuitive, but I'm not quite sure how much weight to place on that. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, I'm not sure how confident I am in this question, but if you were to justify that idea that we know the intrinsic nature of consciousness just by being conscious, how would you go about justifying that?
Good. So, I mean, firstly, just as a bit of background, people might be interested in that this is kind of one of my central academic contributions that I haven't really talked about in public work. And it's just recently I've been thinking I could talk about this in public work as well. And this is really where I disagree with David Chalmers a bit. I remember doing my PhD. I was very happy when I realized I didn't agree with Chalmers on how to attack physicalism. And not just for the sake of it, but I genuinely did. And then I thought, it's good to have something to say in your PhD. But I do really focus my critique in my academic work on this. It's sometimes called revelation in the academic context, that we somehow grasp the nature of consciousness by being conscious. But I totally agree with you, Joe, that it needs to be put in a nuanced form, and this is something I've developed in my own work over the years. I agree with you that there's a lot of force to the Schwitzgebel cases. Or to take another case, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Ned Block's overflow thesis, that there is much richness to our conscious experience that we don't have cognitive access to. Experiments with change blindness, for example, show this. I meditate every day, actually. I've done this for a few years now, and it's really changed my life in lots of ways, spiritually deepened me. But I think when you meditate for a long time, you do realize how much you project on your experience, you cognitively projected. You think you're just being aware of your breath, but actually in very subtle ways, you're sort of projecting an idea of the breath on the breath. That's something I've realized over meditating over a long period of time. So this is the nuanced way I put it. Insofar as you know what it's like to be you, you grasp and understand the nature of your consciousness. So that allows for these possibilities that Bloch and Schwitzgebel are showing, that we in subtle ways, I don't quite know what it's like to be me. But insofar as I do, then I grasp the nature of my consciousness. I mean, what does this mean when we understand the nature of a property? Maybe give an uncontroversial example. Like, both of us know the nature of a triangle. To be a triangle is to be a three-sided figure. When you know that a triangle is a three-sided figure, you know what essentially defines a triangle, what it is to be a triangle. Now compare that to a feeling. I mean, a very particular kind of feeling, like a particular kind of toothache or something. I would say, insofar as you know how that toothache feels, you know what it is to feel that way. I mean, that's what essentially defines what a feeling is, how it feels. Just as having three sides defines what it is to be a triangle, feeling a certain way defines a feeling. So you know what it is to feel a certain way when you know how it feels. Now, that sounds trivial, and I think it is. I think it's self-evident and trivial. But as soon as you accept it, I think physicalism makes absolutely no sense.
Okay,
it may sound like a bold claim.
we'll definitely come on to that, because I think critiques of physicalism are very interesting.
What do you think about that claim, right? focusing on a particular feeling like a toothache. When you know how it feels, you know what it is to feel that way. Does that sound self-evident?
I agree
to you?
that it sounds very, very... My concern, partly, is that it seems like what we would need for a kind of plausible version of panpsychism is that we need to carve out the essential properties of consciousness from the accidental properties of consciousness, right? So, like, for example, what it's like to be me, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but what it's like to be me has all sorts of properties that at the very least seem like I don't want to impute to fundamental matter. I don't want to impute to it the instinctive, perfectly pre-theoretic reaction I have when somebody calls my name, right? I don't even think I share that with other people. And that's part of my pre-theoretic experience of being me. In as much as, somebody says, Joe, I don't even think about it. I just look over in that direction. So called like cocktail party effects. And having a toothache is another example, right? If I know directly what it's like, what it feels like to have a toothache, I don't necessarily want to take properties like that and then impose them on the, fundamental nature of reality. However, so then it seems like we need to have some way of carving out the essential properties of consciousness that we do want to impose on the fundamental nature of reality, and these accidental properties that don't matter very much. However, I don't see quite how to do that without introducing quite a lot of theory. And it seems like the very attractiveness of knowing the intrinsic nature of consciousness simply by being conscious is the fact that it like seems and feels, rightly or wrongly, certainly feels to me, very pre-theoretic. It seems like I don't have to do much thinking or theorizing. I can just like allow it to reveal itself to me. But then it seems like lots of things seem to reveal themselves to me pre-theoretically in this way, if we accept that it's all pre-theoretic, which we will for the time being, that I then don't want to apply to the intrinsic nature of literally everything. I suppose that's a problem that I kind of have here. It seems like we want to pare down consciousness into something quite minimal so that it can do this job of being the intrinsic nature of everything. But it seems like the richness of my pre-theoretic experience of consciousness is massive, right? And I don't want to take all of that richness and impose it downwards.
I think there are two things going on here that it's important to distinguish. One question is, do I understand the essential nature of my own consciousness, of my own toothache, for example? And then the second question is it coherent, plausible to attribute something similar to particles? Just staying with the first question, I think maybe the way to make the case strongly is to contrast with the alternative, which is the mainstream physicalist position of someone like David Papineau. He's been a very, very good friend and mentor of mine, despite our disagreements. So Papineau think about this toothache, how it feels. He thinks you know nothing about the essential nature of that feeling. You can just point at it. They think that's all you can do. It's like when you think about your toothache in terms of how it feels, you're just sort of pointing at something. Oh, it turns out it's a brain state you were pointing at. You didn't know that's what you were pointing at because you could just point at it. And that works perfectly for the physicalist because it puts consciousness in the same category as these other scientific identities. What's lightning? We just sort of pointed it. Oh, it's electric. It turns out it's electric discharge. Science tells that. What's water? We just sort of point at it. It turns out it's H2O. So for Papineau, we're just doing the same with the toothache. We're pointing at something and we don't know what the hell it is. We're just pointing at it and it turns out it's a pattern of neural firings. I think that's crazy when it comes to consciousness, that when I'm thinking about my pain in terms of how it feels, I'm just sort of pointing at something. I don't know what it is. I think we have rich understanding of what feelings and experiences are by feeling them, knowing what it's like to have them. That is rich, positive understanding of what consciousness is. Yes, we might get certain things wrong, but to a large extent, we have rich understanding. So you've got to ask yourself, contrast the two positions. Do you go with Papineau and say, we're just pointing at something, we don't know what the hell it is? Or do you think, no, to a large extent, we know what this is essentially is? That's the choice point, really, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see the intuition there. I suppose it's very hard to come up with analogous examples because, by its very nature, they all run through experience. However, I mean, one thing or counter example that I suppose someone could give is like, take this thing water, right? When I can have, it's not just that when I point at water, like I'm just pointing at something and I don't know anything about it. Like I can touch water, I can feel it, I know that it's wet, I know that it sustains life, I know all these things about it. And yet I still discover something new about what it is when I look at it and I discover that it is H2O in a particular physical state. I could sort of see, someone in kind of Papineau's who leans towards the Papineau-esque position, saying, well, yeah, it's true that you know a bunch of stuff, like you know what it does effectively internally, but nonetheless, a physicalist comes along eventually, in our kind of theoretical positive future perfect neuroscience that we appeal to a lot in philosophy of mind, we will find out what it is you were pointing at. That's not actually my position, but I think that it strikes me as something quite a potential counterexample here.
A lot of these discussions start with Saul Kripke and his very important book, Naming a Necessity from the 1980s. And it's interesting, like both sides of this debate draw from Kripke. So Kripke contrasts the consciousness case with these other scientific identities, and he says actually with water and lightning, we pick it out by its accidental properties, right? We pick out water by how it tastes, how it looks, that it falls from the sky, that it fills oceans and lakes. We pick out lightning by how it looks in the sky, and then science tells us its essential nature. And then he tries to apply that to consciousness, to the feeling of pain. How do we pick out the feeling of pain? By how it feels. But pain just is a feeling. And so, to put it another way, the appearance-reality distinction collapses when it gets to consciousness. In all these other cases of scientific phenomena, there's how it appears and how it essentially is. But with consciousness, that makes no sense. It's the appearance is the reality, right? We're talking about how things seem. That's what consciousness is. How things seem to you. The seeming is the consciousness. So
I mean, is this the point at which we, the physicalist and the non-physicalist reach a sort of argumentative bedrock? In that it seems like, if it seems to me that the very thing that most physicalists will deny, like kind of active physicalists. I say materialists for the sake of argument, because I think that a lot of people who call themselves physicalists probably don't actually need physicalism. They're probably something closer to methodological naturalists. But let's say the hardcore physicalist, surely the thing that they're denying is that appearance is reality when it comes to mental states. I don't know. I can't think of anything. I can't think of a version of physicalism that doesn't say that there's got to be some kind of appearance reality distinction when it comes to consciousness. Consciousness seems like this, but it really is this. So is this just where you kind of butt head? You're kind of at rock bottom regarding the kind of initial assumptions of the debate?
Yeah, maybe we're getting to that point. I mean, just again, to give a bit of background on the academic debate, I think the way David Chalmers set it up was very different, at least superficially. He set it up in terms of his complicated two-dimensional semantic framework, which I'm not going to go into. It's very complicated, and I actually disagree with that, and I agree with physicalists like David Papineau that there's too much baggage, too much built into that, and so the debate has sort of moved on a little bit, at least in certain discussions, and something that's become known as the new challenge, which is how a physicalist accounts for at least the sense that knowledge of our consciousness comes with kind of rich understanding. That, I mean, come back to Mary, and we don't necessarily need to go into the whole Mary thing, but when Mary finds out what it's like to see red, it seems like that's substantial knowledge. She might be curious, mightn't she? She might think, I wonder what it's like to, when she's only seen black and white, but she knows all the neuroscience. She might say, I wonder what it's like to see red. Ah, that's what it's like. So I guess a lot of physicalists will want to concede there's at least a sense that there's some rich knowledge here. Can we give a sort of deflationary account to that? That's been some of the discussion. But yeah, look. How do we do philosophy? How do we do theorizing? At some point, you just have to start with what seems most evident. And I would say the idea that I have some significant understanding of my consciousness by being consciousness. I know what pain is by feeling pain to a large extent. We've got some nuances. I think that seems to me pretty bloody self-evident. And of course, if there was no viable theory of consciousness that assumed that, okay, we get into problems. But I mean, to be honest, I don't really see any theoretical reason to accept physicalism at all. So I don't see any reason to jettison this assumption, which seems to me so close to self-evident, given that there's panpsychism and certain forms of dualism can accommodate it quite easily.
I mean, yeah, that's right. And I do really want to talk about physicalism because I'm an anti-physicalist because of Carnap, which puts me in quite an interesting camp. As in, I kind of, phenomenalism seems to me to be like a very, very, or as I sometimes called it, trivial idealism, which I think in many ways is effectively what phenomenalism is. But regarding because I agree that I think one of the reasons why philosophy of mind is very difficult to talk about is because oftentimes it's very difficult to talk about anything without going through experience to talk about it. And the very thing at issue is the direct nature of experience. Now, to put my cards on the table, a lot of the reason why I find discussions like this quite difficult to get my head around is because I think when I experience pain, I'm not necessarily experiencing what it is, but I don't think that physical investigation will experience what it is either. I think we just get at what things do. Like I can't see myself having kind of total direct access to lots and lots of things. And I'm also very, skeptical about some of my most strongly held introspective intuitions, like that I have a self, right? Viewers of the channel know I'm very skeptical about the idea of the self. And that's like a really, really strong internal feeling, is the unification of consciousness. And yet it seems to fall apart. So I think there are significant errors that occur in kind of introspective intuitions. But but let's talk about physicalism, because I do want to move on to some of the problems with it. And potentially some of the places where we kind of end up at similar places through very, very different routes. So there are some, again, my issue with physicalism is that I don't think that we need it. I think that most of the good stuff in physicalism comes from some form of methodological naturalism or a kind of loose empiricism. And that talking about whether the intrinsic stuff at rock bottom is physical kind of seems like a sort of, it seems like an addition that you don't need. But I'd be interested to get at what you think about this. What is the route that you took to not being a physicalist?
I think it's really largely to do with what we've already been discussing. I think physicalism makes a lot of sense if we have no idea what consciousness is before we do science. When we think about our feelings and our experiences, we're just sort of pointing inside ourselves. Then physicalism makes a lot of sense. I mean, maybe it might be worth correcting a sort of common misunderstanding of what physicalism is. I think a lot of people think of physicalism as sort of this view that electrochemical signaling produces consciousness. So consciousness is this extra stuff, this sort of inner movie, and then the electrochemical signaling brings that into being. That's not physicalism. In fact, that's David Sharma's dualism. Right? That's not physicalism. Physicalism is the view that consciousness is the electrochemical signaling of a certain form. That's just what consciousness is. And yeah, that makes perfect sense if introspectively we've no idea what consciousness is. If David Papineau is right that introspectively we've no idea what consciousness is, then sure, Look to science. Science can tell us it's electrochemical signaling or whatever. But if we already know what it is to a large extent with the nuances I gave, then that whole model is just makes no sense. It's the wrong way of thinking about the problem.
And did the merry knowledge philosophical zombies argument, was this part of the story there for you, or was it just this kind of raw kind of sense that there is a datum that needs accounting for, and that datum is that we have introspective knowledge of the intrinsic nature of consciousness?
I basically think this stuff that's called revelation, that we have some significant understanding of what consciousness is from the inside, I think that is really what's going on underlying all of these arguments, right? Because suppose that's false. Suppose it's false. Suppose we've got no idea what consciousness is. Then yes, you could say physicalists could say zombies are conceivable, but they're not possible because they only seem conceivable because we don't know what consciousness is, right? At least not a priori or introspectively. It's like, water that's not H2O is conceivable, right? It's conceivable that water's a fundamental element, or that it's H2O. It's conceivable that lightning is the anger of the gods, because it's conceivable because we don't know what it is till we do the science. The only reason that fails with consciousness is because we do know what it is already. And I think it is a complicated story here, but I think then claims about conceivability start to have a little bit more significance and form. So yeah, without that, what's conceivable? What, all this abstract reasoning, how the hell does that connect us to reality? It's only that it only connects us to reality in this case because we have direct access to and understanding of the phenomenon. So that's why in this unique case, this kind of abstract philosophical reasoning gets some traction.
Right, okay. So really it's kind of that's the kind of thing underpinning whether you'll find the merry knowledge argument or philosophical zombies persuasive. So it just is this kind of intrinsic nature. I suppose, again, one question I would have is how would we differentiate the situation from where we have direct access to the nature of conscious states and a situation where we are being misinformed about the intrinsic nature of conscious states and we're simply introspectively perceiving what they do, so to speak? Is there a distinction there?
This is a very good question, and for many years I've done an on-off YouTube channel called Mind Chat with an illusionist called Keith Frankish, who thinks exactly this in a way. He thinks I am subject to a deep and profound illusion. And, and in a way, that's actually the form of physicalism I find most plausible. And David Chalmers does as well, as it happens. I think it's a possibility. Maybe natural selection has sort of brainwashed me into being completely wrong about this matter. I give an analogy in my Why book to 1984, where the main character is brainwashed to think that 2 + 2 is 5. And it seems self-evident that 2 + 2 is 5. But so, yeah, look, it's a possibility that I am radically wrong about this. But here's another possibility. We're in the Matrix. That all of this is a delusion created by the evil computers, and it's all messed up, or here's another possibility. Our mathematical intuitions are radically wrong. 2 + 2 is actually 5. So if you're going to play this game of, I'm not going to trust any seemings, you're not going to do science. You're not going to know anything, really. I think we're getting down to epistemological foundations now. I think all you can do is start with what seems most evident. And these facts about the reality of consciousness, as I ordinarily understand it, more or less, actually, that seems to me more evident than the reality of the external world, the reality of this table in front of me. So if I'm going to trust my senses and, trust science, then I'm going to trust these very general, basic commitments about consciousness. So in other words, I think illusionism is a possibility, but I'd need a bloody good reason to believe it. And I don't think there is a good reason to believe physicalism of any form.
I mean, in many ways, the your argument thus far has kind of been a kind of modus ponens, modus tollens pair with Keith Frankish's argument for illusionism. In that, his argument, as I understand it, is that we have this broad kind of physicalist understanding of the world that is so incredibly successful in a whole host of ways. There is this anomalous thing that seems like it really doesn't fit with this. We have two options. We can either abandon this very, very successful paradigm, or we can say, despite the fact that it really seems like this doesn't fit with the paradigm, it ultimately will, or ultimately does. I know that's quite what Frankish says, but that's kind of my kind of simplified reconstruction of Frankish's point. And in many ways, yours is the same argument in reverse. It's saying, no, we are so certain of that we know the intrinsic nature of consciousness directly that we ought to reverse this argument and say, no, if this doesn't fit, we have very good reason to, despite how helpful this is, suggest that this physicalist paradigm is fundamentally incomplete. It's interesting. I don't know, people might diverge on this because depending on where their prior credences lie.
Well, but Joe, you said it yourself. We need to distinguish physics from physicalism. Physics is amazing. The knowledge it's given us of what stuff does is absolutely wonderful, and it's produced technology that's transformed our planet. That's all fantastic. But a panpsychist accepts that as a dualist does, and I think the scientific data is neutral on all of these philosophical possibilities with consciousness. And indeed, as I've argued in my book Galileo's Error, physical science 400 years ago kicks off with Galileo taking consciousness out of the domain of science so that we can just focus on, what we can capture mathematically about what stuff does, so that we can give a purely objective, quantitative description of things. And it was a good move, right? It allowed us to focus on a narrow bit of reality so we can make progress. Right. And I think now we're going through a period of history where people are so blown away by how well that's gone that they think, it's going to explain everything. It's going to explain consciousness. Well, no, it's gone well because it was designed to ignore consciousness, So I think if we're going to bring consciousness back into our story of reality, we need to find a way to bring back together what Galileo separated. And I think panpsychism looks to be the best way to do that. We don't just sort of pretend consciousness doesn't exist. We acknowledge that for the past 400 years, science has depended on putting consciousness outside, and we rethink things a bit, which is not, and we keep doing science exactly as we've been doing it. That's fine. But to bring consciousness back in, we need to sort of rethink things a bit philosophically.
Fantastic. And kind of final on this point before we move on to a different topic. One worry, and it's a worry that I sometimes have, I'm reading papers to do with philosophy of mind, which is where, we have this kind of debate about what the intrinsic nature of consciousness might be. And it seems like, as you've just said, the dualist, the panpsychist, the physicalist, they can all kind of help themselves to the discoveries of science in a whole host of ways. You can make these, whatever intrinsic nature of consciousness you fancy, you can, if you like, fit it into our observations about the world. If the world seems observationally pretty much exactly the same, whatever intrinsic nature we slot in to our philosophical picture of the mind, what exactly hangs on this debate? As in, doesn't it seem, it's very tempting, and I kind of have this myself, to kind of say this all seems like much of a muchness. You can slot in physicalism, you can slot in panpsychism. I think slotting in dualism is more difficult because you could presumably have certain inferences about consciousness persisting after death, which is observational, this eschatological verification and things like that. But with these panpsychist and physicalist camps, it very much seems like the world looks exactly the same, whatever intrinsic nature you slot in. And I'm quite skeptical about our ability to access intrinsic natures anyway. So I don't know, what would you say to somebody like myself who occasionally reads this debate and sort of ends up thinking, I don't know, these pictures of the world look exactly the same to me?
I mean, firstly, I would say, not everyone has to be interested in, the fundamental nature of reality. And lots of people aren't, and that's fine. And, it depends what you're interested in. If you want to understand consciousness itself, what it's like to be a human being, I would say don't ask a philosopher or a scientist, read some literature, watch some fantastic movies, read Dostoevsky. That teaches us what it's like to be a human being. But I suppose I think it's an important, noble part of the human project to try to have our best guess as to the fundamental nature of reality. It's very uncertain. As I say, my confidence in panpsychism is maybe about 60%. It's all very uncertain, but I still think there's something intrinsically important, if I can use that word intrinsic in a slightly different context. There's something intrinsically important about trying to do that, struggling to understand reality, even if it doesn't end up making a practical difference. But actually, just to add to that, sometimes it does make a practical difference in surprising ways. I always like to give the example of the Reverend Thomas Bayes wrestling with trying to respond to Hume's argument against miracles, produced Bayes' theorem, which is now so foundational and important in so many bits of science. And I think with consciousness, the questions I tend to focus on most are, on the face of it, quite abstract and theoretical and conceptual. But I think with consciousness, I really think you need the scientists and the philosophers working closely together and ultimately making progress on these very, very real, practical, ethical questions like which things are conscious, which animals are plants conscious, or, people in comas, are they conscious? Can we communicate with them? When these billionaires start uploading their brains, their minds rather, will that be consciousness, or will they be essentially committing suicide? If anyone saw the Chinese robotics display for their Chinese New Year, it's completely incredible. I think, in the not too distant future, we are going to have in our houses, or at least wealthy people will have, robots that you can talk to like a normal human being, and people are going to be falling in love with their robots, demanding the right to marry their robots. We're going to know, this is going to be really important. Are these bloody things conscious? So I think in all sorts of subtle ways, the more abstract, theoretical, philosophical stuff can potentially impact these more practical, which things are conscious questions. So that was a long-winded answer.
Is that in a direct way? So do you think there are kind of inferences we can make from whatever we conclude about the intrinsic nature of consciousness to how we ought to view these things? Or is it that, because that's one way of doing it, but one, for example, I've recently been thinking a bit more about metaphysics more generally, and I've sort of gone, okay, well, let's look historically. One of the most interesting elements of early quantum physicists is how much interest they took in logical positivism, right? That's a connection between a very, very abstract view of how to do inquiry and a direct physical result. And that's not kind of inferential. They didn't sit down and reason it out from those premises, but nonetheless, the sort of broad abstract philosophical view they took influenced the way that they thought about the phenomena that they encountered. Is that the kind of framing that you're thinking of when we talk about the link between the intrinsic nature of consciousness and this other stuff, or is it something much more direct?
Yeah, I think there are all sorts of nuanced, subtle, but important connections. Roughly speaking, the way I think about it is the scientific task is to work out which things are conscious, which kinds of physical activity go along with consciousness, and consciousness of which kinds. And then the philosophical task is why? What's the general theory of reality that makes sense of that? But I think these can impact each other. There's been a lot of papers coming out recently, actually, maybe prompted by the lack of consensus in the science of consciousness, pointing to maybe it's more theoretical, philosophical assumptions that are really impacting the science. So forget these big questions of physicalism, panpsychism, dualism, just how we are interpreting the data about where consciousness is in the brain. I talk about this a little bit in my Why book, influenced by a very good philosopher who would disagree with me on all sorts of things, but is very interesting on the science of consciousness, Matthias Michel, and talking about this question of that we touched on earlier. Can there be experiences or aspects of your experience that you don't have cognitive access to? I would say, yes, it could be. It could be there's lots of subtleties of my experience I miss out. Other philosophers say, no, if you're experiencing it, then you know about it. You can't experience something if you just got no access to it. And which way you go on that impacts whether consciousness is in the front or the back of the brain, to slightly oversimplify. Because if you think consciousness has to go along with cognitive access, as for example higher order thought theorists do, then the prefrontal cortex is essentially going to be involved all the time. Whereas if you don't think that, if you think you can have experiences you're not cognitively aware of, then consciousness could be more in the sensory areas at the back of the brain. So actually what I think maybe we need to do is to temporarily fragment the field into philosophy science teams with scientists working on the philosophical assumptions that shape how they set up the experiments, how they interpret the data, and just go for it and see what bears fruit. Because at the moment, I think people aren't fully on board with how important the philosophy is. And so it's just all, it's a bit of a mess. I mean, there's a lot of really important, interesting science, but there is no consensus on this foundational question of which bloody things are conscious.
I certainly think that I'd be very surprised if neuroscience in 70 years' time hasn't gone through, in Kuhn's terms, a period of revolutionary science where the whole field has sort of been rethought along incredibly radical lines. Sorry, I know I keep saying one more point. It's because I find it so interesting. I suppose the potential worry that I have regarding intrinsic natures, and it's a similar worry I have regarding a lot of philosophy which trades on very strongly held intuitions, is that you say it seems very, very right. It seems undeniable that I know the intrinsic nature of my mind. And then someone like Keith Frankish says, no, it seems very, very intuitive that you don't. If we reverse our approach here slightly, our intuitions seem to become flips. And I suppose my worry is that I can't see a methodological way at present of reconciling these quite close to bedrock intuitions. And that suggests to me, not that it's, it doesn't suggest to me that it's a question without an answer, but it does suggest to me that, or at least it raises a concern in my mind that it's a question without a method. And I don't know, I think that might trouble you less than it troubles me, but it certainly gives me pause for thought. I think that quite a lot of the time when people, for example, I think the intuition behind when people say things like, if it's not an empirical question, then it's not a question at all, which I don't agree with. But I think the intuition behind that, or the kind of impetus behind that, is that I think people are worried about debates that don't have a set method for resolving the conflict. Like there's no further thing that can be appealed to resolve these two competing intuitions. Is it that do you think that there is something that we can appeal to eventually resolve these competing intuitions that seem pretty close to bedrock? Or is it that you think that despite the fact that there doesn't seem to be a clear method to resolve these intuitive clashes, that nonetheless they are worth persisting with? They're still kind of substantive disagreements that we can make progress in.
Well, welcome to philosophy. I don't know. It is very difficult, isn't it? But I mean, I suppose I would emphasize again, look, there is just no way around. I'm not going to trust seemings. because then you don't know if you're not in the matrix. So I would resist this idea that there's something very particular about me trusting my intuitions about consciousness. And then people who don't do that, they're okay because they're not trusting intuitions. I feel the illusionists often sort of try to push that line. But look, I think when push comes to shove, your knowledge of the external world is via seemings, or your memory, right? How do you know your memory is, maybe Bertrand Russell was right that the world was created 5 minutes ago. And so, I mean, I like Michael Humer's work. People might be interested. I had a chat with him on my YouTube channel, or was it my Substack? I can't remember which now. Who thinks, this is what knowledge bottoms out in. It's called phenomenal conservatism, that knowledge just bottoms out in seemings. And then I just think, what is the methodology, you ask? I think everyone just has to make the judgment for themselves about which seemings are the strongest, which things are most evident. Because what else are you going to do? I mean, how can we make progress on this? I mean, one thing I think actually, maybe we would make more progress if society more generally and the scientific community were more aware of the philosophy in the way they used to be in the early days of quantum mechanics, right? I mean, it's interesting with quantum mechanics. In the 1920s, when it first emerged, the physicists were very into the philosophy of the time, right?
I think Ernst Bloch had sorry, not Ernst Bloch. Sorry, no, I'm thinking of Mach. I always get the two confused.
Yeah. And a certain kind of anti-realism. And this leads to the sort of Copenhagen interpretation. Now, that philosophy is pretty outdated, is really, at best, a minority view. Logical positivism is sort of almost entirely rejected. But now, the physicists don't know anything about the philosophy. And so, they stick with the Copenhagen interpretation. So look, I mean, just on consciousness, I feel a lot of the public and the scientists have this idea, we're going to explain consciousness. We're going to solve the hard problem. We're going to give some kind of intelligible explanation of the kind you get, for example, explaining the liquidity of water in terms of its molecular structure. Actually, the vast majority of physicalist philosophers have given up on that, have realized it kind of doesn't make sense because our concepts of consciousness are so different to our physical concepts. Physical concepts are about what stuff does. Consciousness concepts are about what it's like to have an experience, about these qualities we immediately apprehend in our experience. You're never going to get that kind of intelligible explanation. So the vast majority of physicalists have given up on that. So in a way, I mean, I think like if you take the view of the ordinary scientist that we need to give an intelligible explanation of consciousness, and you take the view of the average philosophy physicalist that you can't do that, then you're going to end up giving up physicalism. So I don't know. I think how to move forward, I think it might be about getting more people aware of what's going on in the philosophy. Is the kind of physicalism we find in philosophy now, which holds that we don't know anything about the nature of consciousness from the inside, we're just sort of pointing at it, is that kind of plausible?
I think quite a lot of the disagreement here is about intrinsic natures. And I think that, quite a lot of the skepticism, including my own skepticism, is about being quite unsure about what it is, about what it would mean to get at the intrinsic nature of something. How do I spot when I'm experiencing the intrinsic nature of something versus when I'm not experiencing the intrinsic nature of something? I think that seems to be where at least our disagreement lies. Yeah. And to be fair, that might be, I don't know where that is with other people, I think partly because I'm not a physicalist, I'm a kind of pragmatist, which means that I'm for example, I'm not like I'm not a micro-reductionist for the reasons that I think it's impractical, rather than because, maybe it's possible for a being of enormous intelligence. For a being of infinite intelligence, but we're not beings of infinite intelligence. So I've got to work with what I've got. Or at least I'm not a being of infinite intelligence. Maybe those in the audience might be. And if so, become a micro-reductionist.
just let me say one more thing. I mean, I believe one thing holding back progress is scientism, right? This view that finding out about reality is just doing experiments, getting the data. I think a lot of the public and scientists just don't see that philosophy has any role to play in finding out about reality. Maybe it's just there to make us feel a bit better about how science tells us the world is. But they don't see a role for philosophy in finding out about reality. And with consciousness and with quantum mechanics, actually, I think, you do need the philosophy. You need a philosophically informed public. You need philosophically informed scientists. Now, maybe when that happens, I hope it will happen, maybe we will get more consensus. Maybe we'll find people have kind of similar intuitions on the whole. I honestly think a large part of the what's clinging people to physicalism is this scientific idea that it's the science option, when it's when the science, I think, is just neutral on all of these options.
Yeah, I think there are definitely. I think that the advantage of science, which is a similar thing to the advantage of mathematics, right, is that you have a kind of, within certain assumptions, you have a sort of necessary convergence, or it seems like, let's say, that it certainly, that's the perception. I'd argue that actually for certain areas like empirical psychology, there's not necessary convergence, because I don't think the human being is like a natural kind in quite the way that a lot of us want them to be. I think there's too much in-group variation there to say much. But certain quibbles aside, I think with something like science, people are comforted by the fact that there is a methodology there that they know is going to converge on something. We're going to observe, to use a toy example, we're all going to observe the table, and even if we're observing it from different angles, we're going to we all see roughly the same things in the same situation, even if there's some variation. So we're going to be able to converge upon a picture of the world that is like empirically adequate, let's say, because I'm not a scientific realist, so I can just say empirically adequate and hand wave the rest. But and likewise with mathematics, even people might start from very different mathematical assumptions, but once you've got a certain set of axioms, a certain set of assumptions, there's a way to check who has the right answer. I think that a lot of people's worry with philosophy, which I don't think actually holds for a lot of philosophy, but I think certainly holds for some, is a sort of idea of you don't want to relax your theoretical or your cognitive constraints so much that you let too much through the door. And I think that, and there are different ways out of this, right? I mean, the classic kind of 19th century German solution is to view philosophy as a kind of building, a sort of, part of a well-rounded education. And actually it being, at least partly for personal edification as much as anything else. And it's interesting that we kind of, because I think the thing that holds a lot of philosophy back, including philosophy of science, is this idea of reality. Reality seen from nowhere. I just think that's like, I don't know what, I mean, it sounds trivial to say, but I don't know what a reality seen from nowhere would look like. And this is why I've got very into Hassok Chang and operational coherence and things like that. That's kind of my, because again, it's like the thing that matters to me about science isn't that it tells us about the external world, it's that it pushes up against something that we can't deny and that isn't in our control, and that we have to adapt ourselves around that. And I think philosophy sometimes does that, but I think there are elements of philosophy where maybe we don't have as clear a methodology, and I think that getting our methodology, even though it's kind of a constant process of negotiation, I think it is worth placing an emphasis on methodology there. But I'm also very interested in talking about something entirely different, and I wish I had a neat segue into it, but I'm just going to put a hard stop on our consciousness discussion, even though, as always, there's a lot more to say, and talk about mystical experiences, because something that I find very interesting, but I don't know a lot about, whereas you know quite a lot about mystical experiences and have also had mystical experiences in a way that I sadly have not. So I really want to kind of dig into this discussion. First of all, sort of a rough idea of what a mystical experience is. And secondly, what is the kind of epistemic import of mystical experiences?
These are excellent questions. I mean, maybe we could just start with my own personal experience and then build out to the theoretical questions from there, because I think it sort of flows quite naturally. But I mean, this is an experience I've just had very recently. and I'm still sort of processing, trying to make sense of it. And yeah, maybe Joe, you can help me with some of the theoretical questions that arise from it. But yeah, so this is a very recent thing that in very controlled circumstances, under the supervision of a professional therapist, I self-administered a very powerful psychedelic known as 5-MeO-DMT, which is a form of toad venom. And it was fucking terrifying. I want to say that straight off. And to be honest, I want to say, like, I don't think people should do this because I think it is psychologically dangerous, right? These substances are not generally thought to be physically dangerous or addictive, but I think they are psychologically dangerous. They sort of tear apart our ordinary ways of thinking about things. I think that's the dangers in that sense are not often emphasized in discussions of psychedelics. But having said that, I'm not going to do this again in a hurry, but I have done it, and I think it has turned out to be actually one of the most important experiences I've ever had. And I've been thinking about Littles ever since, to be honest. So maybe I could start by just describing how things seemed when I had this experience, okay? And then we can get to the theoretical questions that I'm sure you want to ask. Well, were things really as they seemed to be? But let me just start with how things seemed. I was instantly and completely annihilated, right? I was killed. I was wiped from existence. Philip Goff no longer existed in any sense. And what remained was the indescribable, raging storm of consciousness underlying all things.
Mm-hmm.
That is what I experienced. That is how things seemed in having this experience. I mean, and this is 5-MeO-DMT actually is a nice thing to focus on because it's very uniform, the experiences people have. You could read Michael Pollan talking about his experience, the scientist Christoph Koch talking about his experience, Joe Rogan, if you like, on YouTube. It's a very similar experience, and there's nothing psychological about it. There's no visuals. You don't meet elves. It's barely describable. It is intense, instant ego loss. I would say ego destruction, and an indescribable, almost indescribable experience of, I heard Joe Rogan say, the source code underlying the universe, and something like that this timeless, spaceless, raging storm of consciousness at the base of all reality. That is the experience. And it's very brief. It's sort of perfect in a sense for a philosophical truth seeker. It's this intense, pure, mystical experience. It feels timeless when you're in it, but it's about 10 minutes. So where do you want to go with this, Joe?
I suppose obviously the mystical experiences are an interesting topic. I am a big fan of Christian mystic literature, as certain people in the audience might know. Julian of Norwich has always been an absolute favourite of mine. I think she's like brilliant in all sorts of ways, even though I'm not a believer myself. And likewise, people like Meister Eckhart, profoundly interesting writers. I suppose the obvious question to ask is, you described that, and you quoted Joe Rogan there saying that it's like seeing the source code of reality. And this seems to be a pattern with a lot of mystical experiences, is that they're highly unusual, like highly atypical compared to ordinary experience. And they're accompanied with a strong sense of, I don't know, verisimilitude, veracity. I don't quite know the exact word, but a strong feeling that what one is experiencing is in some sense more real or more true than everyday experience, in a way that, maybe it's just that I'm too left-brained in Ian McGilchrist's terminology to kind of quite understand it. For me, it seems like concepts like truth and reality are kind of bottom out at reproducible ordinary experience. And so it seems to me that there's something different about the way that true or real is being used when it's applied to mystical experiences than when it is applied in what I would consider to be like my anecdotal observations of ordinary speech. So I don't know. I don't really have a kind of direct question, I suppose. First of all, is that kind of right? It's characterized by a sense of real veracity. Like, it seems very, very true. And secondly, like, what makes it seem very, very true? Like, what makes it seem truer than kind of, the fact that my laptop's in front of me or my camera's in front of me?
Yeah, William James, the great William James. I love William James. If anyone hasn't read William James, do straight away. I love James. Seems like a sort of contemporary thinker, even though he was writing
he's fantastic,
over 100 years ago. But he called it a noetic feel, this sense that these are ways of knowing, and ways of knowing that at least seem more true than ordinary ways of knowing about reality. I mean, one thing, a lot of this experience was completely indescribable, but it's very quick. A lot of people talk about it's like a rocket being shot into orbit. It's very, very quick. And what I remember of just going into it was a sense of how naive and wrong my ordinary ways of thinking are. Because, I mean, I was trying to think how to describe this. I mean, I took psychedelics when I was a teenager. This is the first time I've done it again, and I had a very similar thing. I mean, maybe it seems to reveal how conditioned our way of thinking. I mean, to take a kind of very simple toy case, think of a racist, right? When they look at the face of the ethnic minority they hate, they project all sorts of negative characteristics. They think they're just looking, but actually they're projecting stuff on. My experience of taking psychedelics is at least part of it is seeing very clearly, very quickly, how we do that all the time in very nuanced ways we don't notice. And yeah, so as I did this, actually, I started off with weaker versions of this, administering, and sort of nothing happened. And then slightly stronger, and kind of nothing happened, except my nerves went. And then I thought, I'll go for the strongest. I'm kind of ready for this. And it was just instant, absolutely terrifying. And I did have this very vivid sense of thinking, how bloody naive was I to think this, and a sense of like, what the hell? How am I allowed to do this? As I say, it did feel like being annihilated. But how do we? I mean, it's a good question. How do we? It does seem to be real, but of course that doesn't entail that it is real. I always come back to what James said at the end of his great discussion of mystical experiences in the varieties of religious experience. He says, well, suppose you say, like many do, and maybe you're tempted to do, Joe, it's okay to trust ordinary sensory experiences, like, there's a table in front of me, but it's not okay for the mystic to trust what their experience seems to be telling them. There's a sort of double standard there, right? I mean, both could be delusions, right? As we've discussed, it could be in the Matrix. You can never get outside of your consciousness to check whether it's telling you about reality. So there's at least a double standard there that needs to be justified. If it's okay to trust what your sensory experience seemed to be telling you, why is it not okay to trust what these mystical experiences, which seem more evident, why is it not okay to trust them? What do you think, Joe? What's the relevant difference?
Yeah, I mean, I probably lean quite heavily into anti-realism in some sense and say that, what matters is partly that it can't be experienced by other people. So it's not it's not convergent in quite the same way as ordinary experiences. I mean, one worry I suppose I have, and perhaps this is a bit close to home. So someone I know suffers from bouts of psychosis, and whenever he's sort of off his medication, he has a very noetically persuasive experience that aliens are sort of communicating with him. And they communicate all sorts of conspiracies about the world, and they communicate sort of ideas about how the world works. And I suppose it's when the norm that we seem to appeal to there to say your experience is unreliable and you ought not to act on it is something like your experience is non-convergent with the experiences of other people. That seems to be like the accessible thing that we're appealing to. And I suppose what would be the principle that allows us to take into account the seeming veracity of the seeming first-person veracity of mystical experiences that doesn't allow, for example, being in the grip of a psychotic episode to slip through the cracks and also be sort of just as just as truth tracking, for the sake of using a term that I'm quite skeptical about anyway, but let's use it for now, as this kind of mystical experience.
Well, I mean, I would agree with you insofar as we're talking about these experiences where it's very specific and idiosyncratic and particular to a person, or whether it's a Christian seeing Jesus or Mary, or, a Muslim meeting Muhammad, or aliens giving information. And yes, there we're going to want to question. I mean, we know in lots of these cases, people are definitely getting the wrong information. That can be shown. So we've got reason. We've got reason to doubt. And the fact that it's so not uniform is a reason to doubt. But this is, you asked me what mystical experiences are, and I would say that term can cover lots of different things. But what's so great about focusing on 5-MeO-DMT is I don't think that's true about this. It is bloody uniform. It's not psychological. It's not getting information from aliens. It is a very, very uniform, distinctive, particular kind of experience that anyone can have. I wouldn't recommend them to, because I think it's psychologically dangerous. But anyone can, in principle, confirm for themselves. And then you might say, well, okay, but it's just sort of you're lying down with your eyes closed. It's just internal. Okay, but if you're following that logic, you're not going to believe in consciousness, right? Because consciousness is completely private and internal. I guess it gets very, very difficult having this discussion, given that you're an anti-realist, and we're getting all sorts of problems here. But I suppose I don't, again, it's the question of the double standard. So I don't see any relevant difference between my 5-MeO-DMT experience and seeing this cup, which means I can trust one but not the other, right? Both, I would say, could be delusions, but with both, I don't see any reason to think it is a delusion. There's nothing, it's not like aliens, or where you know the information is false, or it's not like culturally specific and non-uniform. It's open for anybody else to check for themselves. I don't see any relevant difference, which means I can trust one but not the other.
That's fair. I mean, I suppose, again, it's very anti-realist. The relevant difference for me would potentially be that one can be incorporated into a sort of public model of the world that allows you to interact with it in various different ways. So there's a sort of, I suppose that would be, it's very, very kind of, interpersonal, I suppose, the distinction that I make is about communicability and interaction and that sort of thing, which again, is a very anti-realist way of cutting the difference. So I suppose if you're a hardcore realist, that might not necessarily appeal to you.
That gets you in trouble with consciousness, right? Okay, fair enough if you want to take that route, but I mean, I think that would lead, to my mind, that would seem to lead to not believing in consciousness, because it's sort of private, subjective. You'd end up with the sort of Daniel Dennett route, that only what's third person observable is real. I mean, this is something I'm discussing in my new book, Heresy, which I've just submitted to the publisher, probably be another year or so before it's out. One thing maybe James doesn't take into account is to what extent how things seem when one has these experiences fits with what you already take yourself to know about reality. So, like, to make that clear, imagine Daniel Dennett had a mystical experience, smoked some toad venom, and had this experience of the raging storm of consciousness underlying all things. Now, that would conflict with what he takes himself to already know. He's a physicalist. He thinks reality is made up of non-conscious particles and fields. So So what his experience seems to be telling him conflicts with what he thinks he knows about the world. So there's a conflict, and that, that might be a reason for him to think he's hallucinating. But in my case, I was already a panpsychist. I already think there's consciousness at the base of reality. So I have this experience that purports to say something a bit more specific about the form of consciousness at the base of reality. Still, but it fits with what I take myself to already know about reality. So that's another an interesting way of making a difference. But that would depend on your worldview. Yeah, as you say, maybe you're an anti-realist. Maybe that would give you a reason to think you're hallucinating if you had this experience. But as a panpsychist, I don't have that defeater.
And I mean, we spoke a little bit about this before we started recording. But you mentioned specifically a kind of coherence between your experiences and the sort of theology of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. A lot of people who have mystical experiences, particularly under those circumstances, will say something like, okay, tend to appeal to some sort of Advaita Vedanta-esque metaphysics in order to, at the very least, describe that, right? Even if they're not saying, I have had the fundamental nature of reality revealed to me, they tend to appeal to that as a way of characterizing the sort of thing they experience. You instead chose, or have kind of compared this to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Now, I suppose, first of all, like, in what sense? I mean, I'm when we were talking just now, I was thinking about St. Maximus the Confessor's kind of idea of the incarnation being evident in all things. Is it that sort of, is that the angle in which this goes, this coherence is made, or is it something entirely different?
Yeah, that's part of it. I think, as you say, most people who take these kind of mystical psychedelic experiences seriously tend to be led to Eastern religion, Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta. The problem in my case, I think, is that I'm also very much persuaded by certain traditional arguments for the existence of God, arguments from the need to explain why the universe exists, why there's something rather than nothing, why the universe is fine-tuned for life. And I don't think Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta have good answers to these questions. I recently, on the Panpsychist podcast, very good podcast if people don't know about it, was debating with two proponents of Advaita Vedanta, like, where does the universe come from? Where does suffering come from? Why isn't there just Brahman? So they think pure consciousness, Brahman, is all there is at the fundamental level. And my question is, why isn't there just that? Why is there ignorance? Why is there a fine-tuned universe? And they tend to say, in this case at least, maybe other Advaita Vedantists would say different things. It's just sort of brute fact, or it's inexplicable, or you shouldn't be asking for an explanation. But I want an explanation. So what I like about Eastern Orthodox Christianity is I think it can do both. It can account for these sort of what's going on in these psychedelic ego dissolution mystical experiences, but it can also give us explanations of why the universe exists, why it's fine-tuned. And I mean, just to sort of as a first step in that, a very important distinction in Eastern Orthodox Christianity is between God's essence and God's energies. So God's essence is God's core identity. And the Eastern Church thinks that's always inaccessible, unknowable, completely other. Whereas God's energies are God as an active living force that is immanent and accessible. So if I'm understanding my toad venom experience through the lens of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, what I experienced was God's energies, right? But there's also God's essence, and I would appeal to God's essence to make sense of why the universe exists, why the universe is fine-tuned. Whereas, Advaita Vedanta just bottoms out with Brahman, which I guess is sort of equivalent to God's energies, And I don't see how you get the universe out of that. So yeah, so it's a way, I suppose, of accommodating both these traditional arguments for God and these psychedelic experiences. That's the way I'm thinking about it anyway.
Right. I suppose it kind of taps into something, what I've always said, that I think the most radical part of theism isn't the sort of non-naturalism, or isn't even the kind of non-physicalism. It's the agential nature of the thing being posited. That strikes me as significantly more relevant than like any of this other stuff, right? Partly because I think most of the philosophical explanations that like pin something on theism are specifically pinning something on God's nature as an agent. That seems to do like an awful lot of work. I think more work than some people realize. I recently changed my mind, God forbid, about the moral argument for belief in God, because I've actually come to see that actually theistic grounding for morality has various strengths over and above other kinds of grounding for realist morality. Largely, actually, just in the practical figure of an enforcer. Matches up the subjective prudence with the moral good. I know there's interesting about, but that also trades on God's agential nature. I mean, is that also the thing you're tapping into here when you talk about, if you accept that things like the fine-tuning argument pose a problem for naturalistic worldviews, then what you want is an agent. You don't necessarily, it's unclear how non-agential explanations would get you much further, or at least non-agential explanations in the vein of Advaita Vedanta.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in our normal ways of thinking about evidence, which are given by Bayes' theorem, the fine-tuning of physics for life is evidence for some sort of goal-directedness, purposiveness in the early universe. And so that points to, in some sense, agency or purpose behind reality. I wouldn't want to be too simplistic and anthropomorphic. I like that the Eastern Orthodox Church thinks that the essence of God is actually completely unknowable, right? So it's not just some sort of big mind, but still, in some sense, purpose or goal-directedness emerges from that. And that's not really what you find in Advaita Vedanta or Buddhism, that there's some goal-directedness behind reality. I mean, I should just add quickly, I mean, I'm actually not a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church, because although I find it helps with a lot of these things, I also am very persuaded by the most discussed argument for atheism, namely rooted in the difficulty of explaining evil and suffering. So actually, I've found my spiritual home combining the mysticism of the Eastern Church with the liberal flexibility of the Anglican Church. So I like, in the Anglican Church, you can be a little bit heretical, a little bit free-thinking. It allows me, for example, to think that God is not all-powerful, which I think is the best explanation of why there's so much suffering in the world. I think God's made the best universe God can. And I also like being in a church where there's women priests. You can be an LGBT-affirming Christian. Now got a woman leader for the first time in its history. So yeah, that's where I've ended up, in this weird mix and match of the mysticism of the Eastern Church and the sort of free-thinking flexibility of the Anglican Church.
I mean, I suppose one thing that I do ponder is, in your mystical experience, you said that you experienced a sense of ego death. Now that, to me, seems to speak quite heavily, if we're taking that as kind of, of a true seeming experience, if we're taking that as kind of good evidence for the sake of this discussion, presumably that speaks quite heavily against the existence of the soul. Or that seems like it would pose some difficulties. The soul as a kind of singular, unified, simple thing. Seems like it would go against your experience of having the kind of ego drop away and revealing, that it's kind of unreality.
That's a really good question, and one I've been wrestling with a lot since I go over and over and over this experience. Actually, I don't think my experience has persuaded me of the non-existence of the self, that the self is an illusion. Here's a very imperfect metaphor that seem to capture, again, how things seemed, whether it's a hallucination or not. Imagine my mind is a light bulb covered in cotton wool. And the cotton wool is kind of what's particular to me, Philip Goff, what makes me, me, and Joe Foley's got his own cotton wool that makes him, him. And then the light bulb is this pure consciousness that doesn't belong to anybody, that underlies all things, and is at the core of my being, is at the core of your being. And then what happened in this experience is that the cotton wool was instantly and violently ripped away. That seems to capture to me how it seemed. And so all that was left was this light bulb of pure consciousness. But that doesn't mean in ordinary life the cotton wool isn't real and the self isn't real. In fact, it felt like something that is real was being torn away and destroyed temporarily, fortunately. So it didn't feel to me like I was seeing that the self was an illusion. It felt like myself was being temporarily destroyed. But lots of people might go different ways on that. But just to add, I mean, I don't believe in the soul, though. I'm a panpsychist, I think.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I'm physical. I'm a completely physical creature with a physical body and brain. It's just that the physical world is made up of consciousness.
And to bring this, just to touch on fine tuning very briefly, she wrote something quite recently, a kind of version of. Is it Luke Barnes? I think the awesome evidence argument for God. I think his example is, a verse of the Book of John written into every particle. Your one is the idea of the Quran being written into the Big Bang or something like that. Could you just explain a little bit about what this awesome evidence argument is, what it's attempting to counter, and how it kind of reconstructs the fine-tuning argument as a problem for naturalism in the face of kind of the objection that I've given and that many others have given, which is that can we really make a judgment about what the likelihood of initial conditions for the universe are going to be? Isn't that just kind of epistemically closed off to us?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. That's exactly what this is trying to respond to. And actually, I think these are the best kinds of objections to the fine-tuning argument. These objections that try to press, can we really make sense of these probabilities? Like, how likely is physics to turn out a certain way? Given that we've only ever observed one physics, we've only observed our universe, right? How likely are the constants to have a certain value? Well, if we'd observed many universes, maybe we could see, which are more frequent, which are more common than others, which kinds of physics are more typical. But if we've only observed one universe, how can we make any sense of probability talk here? I recently debated this with the wonderful Graham Oppy. So his take on this is he thinks the initial state of the universe is necessary. It couldn't have been otherwise. And so he thinks this sort of dissolves the question of explaining, why the initial state of the universe is the way it is. So what I was trying to give is a sort of not so much a kind of detailed response of saying how we make sense of these probabilities. Of course, that work has to be done. And I try to do it in a bit of detail in my Y book and my academic work. But it's trying to say, look, something must be going wrong with this objection, right? So how does the argument go? Well, look, suppose next week scientists discovered that the Quran was written into the initial state of the universe. What do I mean by that? Let me say that a little bit more precisely. Okay, the scientists discover there's this initial state of the universe, which is a little bit earlier than what we knew about previously. And it's actually a very structured state. And scientists take it to be, on our best evidence, the very first state of the universe. And when you look at it, it's just very clear that this state is perfectly structurally isomorphic to the Quran in Arabic. The exact shape of the letters, the relationship with each other, the order, all of that structure is perfectly there, just evident in this initial state. that would be evidence for Islam. Surely that would be evidence for Islam. No one's going to say, oh, it just happened that way. Just the way it's turned out. No, we'd say, look, that's evidence for Islam. And then the thought is, well, I could say this to you, Joe, if you're sympathetic to this kind of objection. If you think, oh, we can't make sense of probabilities in terms of the initial state of the universe, then it looks like you can't make sense of that initial state of the universe being improbable on chance, which is how we think about evidence, right? We think, when we say it's evidence for Islam, what we really mean is, if Islam is true, it's not so improbable that we'd find the Quran in the first state. But if Islam is false, it's wildly improbable that we'd have the exact structure of the Quran in that first state. That's how we think of evidence in Bayesian reasoning. But if we can't make sense of the probability of the initial condition of the universe, then we can't say that. So we just have to say, oh, that's just the way it is. Nothing to see here. So it's a kind of reductio ad absurdum response. It's saying something must be wrong with your objection. Maybe a little bit like Ganillo's response to the ontological argument is, I won't go into that, but if people know about it, the perfect island objection. It doesn't say what's wrong with the ontological argument. It just says something must be wrong, because you end up with this crazy conclusion that the perfect island exists. Likewise, I'm saying to you, something must be wrong with your objection, because if your objection was right, you'd have to say that the Quran being in the initial state of the universe wouldn't be evidence for Islam. And that's crazy, man.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I heard the version of the Gospel of John. I was interested to hear this version as well. As the kind of scratch response I did on Substack, it's a good article, by the way, I should go read it, is that it seems to me like the miraculous thing about the Quran being written into the Big Bang wouldn't be that the Quran is written into the Big Bang. It would the miracle would occur from the completely improbable coincidence of us having written down the initial condition, or us having written down this thing that is in the Big Bang and having come to a particular semantic understanding of it, completely independent of any kind of Big Bang initial conditions stuff. That to me seems to be where the support for Islam would come in. Like if we never had the Quran, then I don't think this would be ever, or if the Arabic language had never been invented. I don't know if invent is the right word to think of a language, but you know what I mean. If we'd never come to have the Arabic language, this would cease to be a miracle. I think that the person who is skeptical about the possibility of other initial conditions for the universe can appeal to the fact that, well, then, we can reason about all of the possible languages we could have come to, or all the possible holy books we could have read, or could have stumbled upon, to kind of stay neutral on their veracity, and that's where this awesome. That's why the atheist or who's skeptical about the fine-tuning argument for this reason can accept the awesome evidence argument and reject fine-tuning.
In a sense, I think you're right, actually. That is a relevant difference. But I think it doesn't help support the particular objection I was aiming at. So there's a bit of nuance here. So let's take a step back. So what is the fine-tuning of physics for life, right? It's the claim is on our current best theories, for life to be possible, certain numbers in physics had to fall in a certain narrow range. And they did, right? So there's two probabilities at play in getting from that scientific evidence to God. One probability is, how likely is it that you'd get the right numbers for life by chance? Right? Another probability is, how likely is it that you get the right numbers for life on theism? Okay? And the thought is, the second probability is much higher than the first probability. So in other words, the evidence of fine-tuning is much more likely on theism than atheism. Okay. Now, what I was focusing on in this response, and as you've said, it's not initially my response, I just had this Islamic take on it, is the first kind of probability. Like, how likely is the fine-tuning on chance? In other words, can we make claims about... So forget God. Can we make claims about how likely the physics we find is on chance, on atheism? And some people say, no, you can't. And I'm responding to that because I say, well, if you say that, then you just can't say the Quran is the Quran being written in the Big Bang is evidence for Islam, because we can't talk about how likely it is on chance. Whereas I think what you're addressing here is how likely is it on theism, and you're saying, well, in the Quranic case, we can say we can point to the fact that it's more likely on Islam because we've got the Quran there in history. We can connect to that. Whereas a lot of people say about, how likely is the fine-tuning on theism? Who knows what the designer's intentions were? So we can't make sense of that. But if we're just... But I think you're focusing on the wrong probability. I think what I'm focusing on is, can we say getting the right numbers for life by chance is really improbable? And... Do you think we can say that?
I mean, I'm pretty skeptical about this sort of, about judging probabilities for kind of universe creation. I suppose my response was effectively saying that I think that an atheist can say, we don't know anything about the probability of the initial conditions of the universe, and still accept that if we found out the Quran was written into the Big Bang, that would be strong evidence for God, because the miracle will come from the correspondence between between these initial conditions and a independently developed language and book. Like a good example, I think, would be if we hadn't written the Quran down and Arabic didn't exist, I don't think that it would be strong evidence for theism to discover. Like, say, because we could anything that we discover about the initial conditions of the Big Bang could be a language, if in the sense that it's any symbol, any set of symbols within certain parameters can be made into a language. It seems to me that the thing that makes the Quran being written into the initial conditions of the universe so convincing for Islam would be because of this correspondence. And that is the route for the atheist to say, yes, that would be decisive evidence for theism. And they could still say, we don't know if there was any other way the initial conditions of the universe could be. The miraculous thing would be that we have stumbled upon the source code of the universe, like completely independently of any kind of direct observation of it.
No, so I think you're still focusing on the wrong probability. And I think maybe I explained it in a sort of long-winded. Let me try again. So I think what you're saying helps with this probability. How likely is the data on Islam being true, on the hypothesis that Islam is true? What you said is relevant for that, because we can say, well, look, it's highly likely because we've got the Quran there and we can make that connection. But what you've said doesn't help with is how likely is that data of the initial conditions on chance?
Oh no! My
right?
point is that
how does discussion of the Quran help us assess that probability? Because that's nothing to do with the Quran. It's just how likely is it on chance?
Well, that's my point is that I think that it seems to me that the kind of thrust of this counterexample is to say that the atheist here would have to say that this isn't evidence for Islam, because they would have to say, well, the initial conditions, we don't know if the initial conditions could have been different anyway. And what I'm saying is that they could still take it as evidence for Islam, even while still holding the proposition that we couldn't know the probability distribution of initial conditions of the universe. Because we know that languages can vary and books can vary and that kind of thing, and they can just lean on that.
I don't think that makes sense in terms of Bayesian reasoning. I mean, maybe we'd have to go through the calculation, but to make sense of the evidential claim, you need both probabilities. You need the probability of how likely is the data on Islam and how likely is it on chance. And you need both. And you seem to be saying, well, I think what you're saying helps us make sense of how likely is it on Islam, but we also need the contrast case. Bayesian inferences are always contrastive. It's like, how likely is the data on this hypothesis? How likely is it on that hypothesis? So we need both. We do need for it to be evidence for Islam. We need both. We need how likely is it on chance, and if you're conceding we can't establish that, then you just can't say it's evidence for Islam.
But I suppose can we say the likelihood by chance here wouldn't be the likelihood that the initial conditions of the universe are this way. The event, it's almost like the atheist is examining a different event under discussion. The event they're examining is then the writing of the Quran. It's not the initial condition of the universe. So it's like the evidence, what they're saying is unlikely to happen by chance and is more likely to happen under Islam within this kind of hypothetical scenario would be the writing of the Quran rather than the initial conditions of the universe. Does that make sense? Like, that's the thing they think is very unlikely to occur on chance. So I'm like saying that they're actually appealing to a different event.
Hold on. The evidence is not the writing of the Quran.
No, that's what I'm saying.
You know, we already the evidence is finding the Quran to be written in the initial state of the universe, and so that's the evidence.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying is for the person who is skeptical about establishing probabilities about the initial conditions of the universe. The reason why this scenario works as confirmatory evidence for Islam is because they're not taking that event to be the evidence. They're taking the event of the writing of the Quran to be the evidence. Like, they're saying that this could be otherwise, it could not be otherwise, we don't know. But we know that the writing of the Quran could have been otherwise. We know that that different books could have been written. We know that different languages could have been created. And so instead, that becomes the thing that is very unlikely to have happened by chance. Like, the initial conditions of the universe, they don't know. But the coincidental writing down of the initial conditions of the universe, that is something that seems very unlikely to be true under naturalism. And that's the thing that would then be very true under Islam.
So I think that's a strange way of thinking about it, given that...
No, it is a very strange way of thinking about it.
No, but in the imagined scenario, we already know about the Quran, and then we get this new data. But I think it doesn't make a difference, actually, because you still always need the contrast. You're still always asking, how likely is it on chance? And so we still need to know, like, how likely was the initial state of the universe being like that on chance, compared with on Islam. So I still think you need the contrastive case to.
I don't know. I think that it seems to me that, say we're kind of have a model of the universe and we run it forward, and we're not sure what let's say we don't know whether the initial conditions could have been different. Then we run the universe forward, and then through an event that is totally or a series of events that are totally unrelated to investigations of those initial conditions. It just so happens that humanity manages to create a language and then write a book. They then assign that language and book semantic significance, totally like independent of any kind of causal chain from these facts about the initial conditions. That, to me, seems like it will be very, very unlikely to occur under naturalism. That extraordinary chain of events going on over here, totally separate from the initial conditions, which may or may not be able to vary. That seems to me to be so unlikely under naturalism and so likely under theism. But then, of course, that would be a way of accepting the awesome evidence argument for God without conceding that the initial conditions could have been different.
Okay, maybe you persuaded me, actually, Joe. I'll have to think about this a bit more. So, so in other words, you're saying we're taking, so in Bayesian reasoning, you always have what's like in the background knowledge that you're taking for granted, and then you have your evidence. So you're saying we put in the background knowledge that there is this structure that I want to say Quranic, but this is before the Quran. There is this structure in the initial conditions, and then we think, how likely is it that someone would write a book that is structurally perfectly isomorphic with that structure in the Big Bang? and so the evidence is that they did. How
Yes,
likely is that on? Yeah,
and so it's like,
maybe,
yeah, I
maybe
mean,
that's okay.
so that's been my response.
I suppose that's very interesting, and maybe you've persuaded me, Joe.
Hi everyone, it's post-production Joe here. I'm just butting in to say that Philip has actually written an article in response to my argument, so I've linked that in the description if anyone wants to check it out. Please do.
This is coming to there's a very big discussion in Bayesian probabilistic reasoning of the old evidence problem. Like, what do we do with I don't know, things we already knew, but we find maybe a new explanation of them or something, or does it always have to be in the order we actually found out about it? Some strict Bayesians insist on that. I mean, actually, I don't know anyone would be that strict, but this is relevant to this case because the actual order was we knew about Islam first, and then I'm imagining we find this data. So a very strict Bayesian might say to you, well, you're getting things in the wrong order and that's not allowed. Now, actually, I'm not a strict Bayesian. I'm a fan of Nevin Klemenhager's rediscovery or bringing back of the way of thinking about the non-orthodox way of thinking about Bayesian reasoning, which was followed by the great economist Keynes, right? He had this non-standard way of understanding Bayesian reasoning, where it's about relations of evidential support between propositions, and then it doesn't really bloody matter, you know. So it's sort of more platonic. It's like these timeless propositions. How are they connected? It doesn't matter like which you found out about first. So I personally couldn't give that response to you. So yeah, maybe you've persuaded me. Maybe I'll have to think about. That's very interesting.
I'll give the response that I got from this, and I threw it out.
You win this one.
Oh, the response I got from this when I threw it out was by Amos Wallen, who's wonderful, who asked me to imagine a scenario whereby we are. We hear a voice in a language we haven't created but intuitively understand, telling us that it is God. And that is like modal distance wise. I still need to figure out what I think of that. But maybe that's a response that you could raise. I'm still puzzling with that one intuitively, or maybe not intuitively. Like, I basically think that I don't know how to make sense of the idea of a language that we intuitively think that we like a priori has semantic content, but we never created. I don't know. That seems to me to be like
good.
I really struggle to make sense of that. But maybe Amos is a great guy and very clever. So I need to sit down and give this more thought. But anyway, that's kind of my.
Good.
I just wanted to talk about that because I thought you put out that article and I was like, I have something to say on the awesome evidence argument. I wonder what Philip thinks about it.
Yeah. No. Well. I saw your response to it. Thank you for responding. And yes, I do think that the way I was thinking about it, taking this imaginary scientific discovery as evidence, the objection fails, and that was how I was interpreting you. But it's good we had this conversation because I'm seeing you're thinking about it in a different way, and I'll have to think about that a bit more. I suspect ultimately I would agree with Amos that there are other cases that avoid this, and maybe another time we could have a debate about that. But yeah, maybe in this case you've got a good response.
Oh, thank you. At the very least, I think that the modal distance matters, right? The weirder you make the counter scenario, the more opportunity somebody replying to it has to pull the modal distance card and say, that's so far from our reality, I don't know how to estimate or reason about it.
Tell me Amos's case again.
Oh, sorry. I'm trying to. I've wrote a note on it, but I can't. I can't find it right now. But it's the idea of imagine that there was a language out there there was a voice out there telling us that it was God in a language that we didn't create, but we all intuitively understood. That wouldn't be evidence for God under my kind of response for this. To your case, and the kind of sketch responses I've had are things like, well, I'm not entirely sure that's a coherent scenario. I don't know how, like, assigning. I'm very skeptical about the idea of like a priori understood semantic content. I kind of don't really know what that means. But as I say, that was also I should say, by the way, that Amos left this in like a kind of 5-line comment. So I'm sure that he has got much more worked out versions of this as well. Amos is great. I always like giving him a kind of shout out when I can.
Well, maybe I'll have another think about it and write a Substack post.
Yeah.
Responding to you on this. Now I understand the objection better, and so that's a good reason for people to subscribe to my Substack, and so they can catch that when it comes out.
And just to kind of finish off, I always ask this to people at the end of interviews. What's the most interesting idea you've come across in the past year, and why?
Well, what I've been thinking about particularly this year is neologism.
Oh wow! What, like Crispin Wright stuff?
This attempt to explain mathematics in terms of logic. You might think, why the hell do you want to do that? But I mean, I think in some sense the default position with mathematics is Platonism, that numbers really exist outside of space and time, and that creates all sorts of problems. How do we know about them? How do we know 2 + 2 is 4? How do we know about these entities that are outside of space and time? What's the faculty that connects us up? If we can reduce mathematics to logic, you at least avoid some of those worries. I don't think you maybe avoid all the epistemological worries in this area, but you at least avoid some of those worries. And there's a fascinating history people might be interested in looking up, or talk about it in my new book, but that's not going to be out for a while. There were big attempts at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, people like Frege, Russell, Whitehead, to make sense of this. And then there were lots of spanners in the works with Gödel's incompleteness theorem, but Russell's paradox more centrally, and it sort of fell apart. But then, as you said, Joe, it comes back with Crispin Wright, thinking maybe we can't do it in the purest way that was attempted at the beginning of the 20th century, but maybe if we were a bit more loose, if we add some extra principles that aren't quite logical truths. For example, this principle that the number of x's equal the number of y's if we can pair up the x's with the y's. So,
yes, Hume's principle, I think that's...
Yeah, Hume's principle. If the number of girls in the class and equals the number of boys in the class, if each girl can be paired with a particular boy. So I was thinking of this in the context of my kids' primary school and explaining it to my 9-year-old child. Anyway, and so that's not quite a logical, sort of a logical a truth of second order predicate logic, but it seems kind of pretty trivial. And if you add that, you can get a lot of the way. So I've just been fascinated and absorbed by that. It takes me a bit out of my skill set. I'm not the most mathematically gifted person in the world, but yeah, it's kind of pure techie philosophy, isn't it? But I'm a bit obsessed with that at the moment.
That's really cool. I mean, because I remember having this discussion with one of my supervisors at university, being like, I don't understand why Hume's principle is any more radical than positing like basic law 5, even if basic law 5 was consistent. Like, it seems to me to be like just as these seem to be just as philosophically costly. Yeah, Crispin Wright, I absolutely love his work. Yeah, NYU have like such a kind of neo-logicist like kind of power team. It's Anyway, thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, Carl, you've made me want to go dive back into neologicism. I loved that during my undergrad, so that's so cool. Thank you so much.
I love. Sorry to interrupt. I love that we've gone from consciousness to toad venom to neologicism. This is like
We've covered a lot of material.
Fantasy. It's brilliant.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you? Just
actually, I've recently just started doing my own YouTube channel, Philip Goff Philosophy, and doing my Substack, doing them regularly. After years of going on other people's channels, I thought, I want to do this myself, and I'm absolutely loving it, sort of being a bit more myself, bringing the cat on camera. So that's it, really. I suppose I always argue too much on X, Philip_Goff, or Blue Sky, my website, Philip Goff Philosophy. Come and argue with me on X, or subscribe to my YouTube channel.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Joe. It's been a hell of a lot of fun.